Okay, everybody, we're going to get started here in just a moment. If we could all go ahead and take our seats. Great. Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed their lunch, and welcome back to the next session. Hopefully, this will be a really informative session. So we really want to dive into some of the details of what was talked about this morning. And so we actually have two great speakers today within this session. Of course, I'm not amongst those. I'm just going to introduce. But I do have with us, first of all, our first speaker is going to be Jennifer Shieh. And Jennifer comes to us from the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And so she actually gets that Executive Office of the President title within her email address. And I think, when we talk about this morning about the culture change that's taking place, I think that's actually one of the most important things is that we actually have this lab-to-market cross-agency priority goal and folks like Jennifer working on this. And what's really exciting about Jennifer isn't that she's just somebody that's sort of wandering in there to the White House without experience, but she actually comes to us from the Small Business Administration, where she's the Chief Science Advisor. And before that, she was at NIH. So she's actually one of us, and she's actually working at the White House and actually being able to really make this a priority item there. And she can talk about how that's going and where we're working in that area. And then, of course, we're happy to welcome back Walter Kopan, Undersecretary for Standards and Technology over at NIST, my boss, which is really exciting. But we're going to talk a little bit more. This morning talked about sort of the overall big picture of what's going on in this area, but really at this point, we're going to dive in a lot deeper on what's in this Return on Investment Initiative paper, the green paper. And I do want to point out, we printed up some of these handy-dandy worksheets out there, so if you'd like to pick these up, they're over by the registration desk, and they actually are just a summary of what's actually in that paper and some of what's covered in Walt's talk as well, so you can take that home with you and frame it, whatever you want to do with it. We'd love to have you take a look at it, though. So without further ado here, let me introduce Dr. Jennifer Shieh. Take it away.
Thank you. And actually, I'm just going to move this out of the way since I have the lavalier. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this super exciting meeting. It's my first FLC, actually. So as you heard this morning from Walt, about 1 year ago, the President's Management Agenda was released. And the President's Management Agenda really lays out a broad, long-term vision for modernizing the entire federal government in really key areas to improve the ability of agencies to deliver on their mission outcomes. And so improving the transfer of federally funded technologies from the laboratory to the marketplace is obviously one of those key areas. There are only 14 cross-agency priority goals, and so lab to market is one of those 14 goals. And so even though this is a priority for the current administration, the recognition that technological innovation is critical for the nation is really not too new of an item. It's something that's been around since the founding of the country. It goes back to the formative years. Our founding fathers were grappling with issues like intellectual property sharing and need to incentivize the domestic manufacturing industry. So this quote from Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers really highlights Hamilton's recommendations to apply lessons learned from established countries from the British Empire to encourage domestic innovation. So even after 2 centuries, some things still remain important, even if they're not necessarily included in a musical. Now, Walt also mentioned that Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer, who is the OSTP director, he was confirmed and sworn in January during the shutdown. He released yesterday a statement on his vision for America's science and technology enterprise. And so the priorities for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is really ensuring that America is a world leader and remains a world leader in science and technology. And that's the mission of OSTP. And so to that end, our work really focuses on unleashing discovery and innovation across the entire R&D enterprise, building the workforce of the future, and advancing American values at home and abroad. So do you see yourself in these priorities? Maybe, yes? Well, you should. Tech transfer really hits on all of these priority areas. So just because before I really came to OSTP, I didn't know what OSTP did exactly. And so how do we work? How do we do this? How do we ensure American leadership? So first off, OSTP identifies emerging science and technology areas to enable their continued development. An example of this is the presidential memorandum that OSTP led the development of for a new drone integration pilot program back in the fall of 2017. And so this presidential memorandum really created a regulatory sandbox or innovation zone to test out complex UAS operations and models for integrating drones into local airspace. So how do we test out really emerging technologies in a safe environment, but still supporting innovation? The second function that OSTP has is in providing the president and other parts of the executive office of the president with advice on the scientific, engineering, and technological aspects of policy areas that may not directly be science and technology policy, including the broader economy, national security, and health. And so an example of this is where OSTP has worked very closely with the Domestic Policy Council in developing the recent executive order on empowering veterans and ending suicide. So OSTP's role in that executive order is on developing a national research strategy and ensuring that the research that is developed along suicide prevention actually gets translated into real meaningful clinical impact. And finally, OSTP really coordinates science and technology policy across the entire interagency. So we work with all of the science and technology agencies. And so convening these agencies that play a role in federal science and technology policy, that's one of OSTP's most critical functions. By coordinating all of the different stakeholders, soliciting and evaluating their input, and facilitating discussion, OSTP can then craft the sound policies and thoughtful advice to provide the president that reflects both the scientific and technical information, as well as representing the important perspectives for each of the different agencies' views that are the subject matter experts. And so one of the primary ways that OSTP convenes the interagency is through the National Science and Technology Council. And so Walt mentioned actually this morning that in a couple weeks, we'll be having a high-level meeting of the National Science and Technology Council members. And so this is the primary mechanism we use, and it's a cabinet-level council that was established by executive order in 1993 in order to coordinate across the entire executive branch. The NSTC plays a really important role in developing any national strategies or topical action or implementation plans that are going to require the participation of multiple agencies. And so while OSTP has people like me who are policy advisors that have specific policy portfolios, really administration policies, we set the policies, but we're not going to be able to be implementing without your help, right? Without the interagency. And so this NSTC body is sort of the mechanism that we use to do that. So the NSTC, the National Science and Technology Council, currently has 6 different committees. We have the Committee on Science, Committee on Technology, Committee on National and Homeland Security, the Committee on the Environment, a committee focused specifically on STEM education, and finally, the Committee on S&T Enterprise, which really covers cross-cutting areas that impact the entire science and technology enterprise. And so, of course, lab-to-market efforts are part of this committee because really, there's no specific topical area that we do not touch, we being the lab-to-market and tech transfer communities. And so that brings me back to the lab-to-market cross-agency priority goal, or CAP goal, to improve the transfer of federally funded technologies from lab to market. And of course, you heard this morning, this is co-led by Dr. Kopan and Michael Kratsios, who's the Deputy Assistant to the President for Technology Policy, and he's been nominated to be the Chief Technology Officer for the US. So just to, this is fun and exciting diving into org charts, right? And learning more about the gunky works of wonks. So participating agencies, as I said, the National Science and Technology Council really convenes the interagency, and so this is how we are getting input into developing the overarching strategy for the lab to market CAP goal, cross-agency priority goal. And we'll also talk to you about the interagency contributors. So it's not only the NSTC kind of high-level lab to market subcommittee members, but also all of the working groups, because this is really a very broad mandate that we have. And so implementing the cross-agency priority goal is through the NSTC and a variety of these interagency bodies, including the Federal Lab Consortium. So I think this is, so FLC is actually a specific representative on the National Science and Technology Council subcommittee for lab to market. And this committee, the subcommittee on lab to market, is co-chaired by myself representing OSTP, by Paul representing NIST, and by Connor Prohaska, who's the Chief Commercialization Officer for the Department of Energy, and Clara Asmail is somewhere around here, but and then Courtney Silverthorne is our exec sec. So we have a really top team here helping shepherd this overall effort. And I do want to make sure that it's clear that the lab to market CAP goal covers the entire $150 billion investment, taxpayer investment each year into research and development. It's really how we're making sure that that entire investment, both to the intramural community and to the extramural community, is making the most impact for what we're putting into it. And so this is really covering the entire innovation ecosystem. I'm not going to belabor the goals. I mean, you can go to the performance.gov website and read through exactly what is it that we're trying to accomplish. But I think you all inherently just know what it is we're trying to accomplish in terms of trying to improve tech transfer overall. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the specific strategies. And I apologize, the fonts kind of got messed up, so you can't read them. But this is really the how, okay? So every administration, I mean, I talked about Alexander Hamilton's, encouragement of promoting domestic innovation. Well, the lab to market cross-agency priority goal is also not a completely new thing. Ever since the government was interested in investing in research and development, we've also been thinking about how do we actually transfer and make use of that research and make sure that it doesn't stay in the laboratory. But I think many of you have been in the field for a number of years, and so is this just another, okay, sure, it's a priority, so what? If we just talk about it, what does that even really mean? But I think that what you'll see is that we really have an amazing opportunity here to do something. So let me talk a little bit more about some concrete steps and milestones that are going to be coming out of these strategies. And feel free to ask more questions about sort of the process of how we got to these milestones. But so when we talk about regulatory impediments and administrative improvements, some of those specific things I think are going to be items that were also laid out in the NIST ROI Green Paper, where there will be improvements in legislative proposals for revisions to the Stevenson-Weidler Act and possible revisions to the Bayh-Dole. It's also thinking about the administrative improvements. So for the SBIR, STTR community, how do we actually reduce application burden on them? How do we reduce reporting burden and still actually be able to get the useful information to understand what our investment is doing in the SBIR, STTR programs? And it's also things like the drone pilot program of creating, how might we actually create more regulatory sandboxes and innovation zones for other types of emerging technologies. Increasing engagement with the private sector. This is really also, this is partly looking at all of those authorities. I know there was a session on other transaction authorities, but what are all the tools that you have in your toolkit to be able to enhance partnerships? It's I think a couple of things that are really actually new that will be coming out and kind of focused in the increased engagement, what is focusing on interagency collaboration to support the overall R&D innovation ecosystem. And I think this is building on work that you are doing, right? There was also a session on creating a rainforest in the desert. And I think that one is a fabulous description of, what does it take? How do we actually support where you are, your engagement and partnerships with the other players in the area? So with your labs, how do you work with the universities? How do you work with the manufacturing USA institutes? How could we support the flourishing of those partnerships and engagement? Another big piece of that engagement is really improving outreach activities, right? And so I think I heard John Dement say this morning that it sounds like FLC may be taking a closer look at outreach and marketing. And so this is something that is obviously very important for everybody, because if you're not able to tell the story, how will you engage with new people? Building a more entrepreneurial R&D workforce, that one, I think, when we think about tech transfer, it's really not just, the value doesn't come just from the investment in the technology development itself, right? There are people involved, and I think that we really need to make sure that we're capturing that value, because our investment in human capital will outlast whatever investment we might have made in the technology itself. So even if a particular company or technology doesn't prove fruitful to go into the marketplace or doesn't sell well, you've still had people involved in that technology development that could go on to create new companies. And so when we talk about the entrepreneurial R&D workforce, this is actually also something that's, maybe you're thinking about I-Corps, which is certainly a part of this. But it's not just about educating the scientists and engineers that are in the universities and kind of the future workforce. It's not just about educating the scientists and engineers that work within the federal labs, but we're also thinking about the program managers and people that work in leadership that maybe don't touch the technologies directly, but how do we support your growth and development in an entrepreneurial mindset? And how do we help support training in an entrepreneurial mindset within leadership in other areas of your agencies? And so this is sort of the slow culture shift attempts. I think a number of these milestones to achieve these strategies are focused on both the quick wins, that things we can do right away now with what we have, but also thinking about how do we lay the foundations to really create that culture shift so that there's a sustained momentum. One other thing I think that would be of particular interest to this community, one of the milestones that we're going to be focusing on building a more entrepreneurial R&D workforce is actually also thinking about developing a job series for federal tech transfer professionals. I think one of the things that's really amazing is how different the pathways, everybody who's here, how you came to this job. Some of us are scientists and engineers, some people are lawyers, some people come from the business end, and so what does that really mean within the federal workforce environment? On supporting innovative tools and services for tech transfer, so of course we have FLC Business, and also I want to give a big shout out to the Department of Energy Lab Partnering Service, who is here today, right out in the apparently they're kind of tucked away in a cubby around the back corner, but go check them out. They're doing a demo. But we have a number of tools that we can use in order to engage. And I think the key message also is that there's not going to be a single one-stop shop. I think there just can't be, because again, people come to engage from many different paths. And so we want to be able to create ways to enter that pathway from wherever they're coming. On improving our understanding of global science and technology trends and benchmarks, I think this is where we get back also to return on investment and One, understanding what information can underlie the stories that we want to tell when we do that outreach. So a couple of items there is really kind of focused on how do we get kind of, one, just a better coherent picture of what the data looks like across the different agencies, and better be able to work together in enhancing that vision. So we have an action plan. Now that you'll see, so the cross-agency priority goals, they have a kind of regular cadence of quarterly updating. And so our next CAP goal update on performance.gov is going to be coming out in June, but we'll be talking amongst the NSTC Lab to Market subcommittee members next week around what is actually going to be out there in the public. And so this really kicks off the implementation, and that will be through the variety of interagency bodies as well as you. So I do want to mention, just in terms of the process of how did we come up with these milestones, how did we come up with the implementation plans, that we had a number of interagency strategy teams. And actually, I know that many of you are either on the NSTC subcommittee itself or you were members of the strategy team. So can you raise your hand if you were? Be proud of it. Own it. Yeah, so thank you to those colleagues who were really engaged in a lot of hard work over the fall and winter, and a lot of really just these excellent discussions about all of the issues and how we can actually make meaningful progress here. And so these proposed milestones, when you see them published on performance.gov, are going to be very high level, but the specific implementation steps above it, we have those in mind, and we do want your feedback on how to make sure that it actually happens. And so there will be kind of implementation teams coming, so kind of be on the lookout to see if that's something you want to be engaged in, to make sure you reach out to your agency NSTC subcommittee representative to let them know. And I guess the last thing I just want to end in is, maybe you noticed or maybe you didn't, but I had a title on this talk on accelerating discovery from lab to market together. And so I want you to reach out to me. Tell me about the amazing work you're doing. We often get too heads down in actually making things happen that we don't take the time to share, but it's really critical for our community that sharing is actually really important to advancing the work itself. So it's worth that time. You've been doing a tremendous job, and we want to use the fact that this is a lab-to-market cross-agency priority, an administration priority, to elevate and support your work. Find ways to supercharge your efforts. I don't have to convince you that tech transfer is important, but sometimes we do need help to convince other decision makers in your agencies. And so if you remember nothing else from this talk, know that tech transfer and lab-to-market efforts, it's a White House priority, so don't let this opportunity just pass by. Make use of this and the ability to take action now in the next 18 months. So, remember that while tech transfer that we're talking about here, of course, is from the federal labs, you are part of a broader innovation ecosystem, and it's about that. So make those connections. Make the connections between your agency's R&D folks and maybe your agency's economic development side. Because of your jobs, you know how critical it is to bring together the science, the business, the law to make a deal happen. And to go back to maybe a fictionalized version of Alexander Hamilton, we are not going to throw away this shot. So, thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much. That's awesome. It is actually a very exciting time to be in government. It actually is working. And sometimes we get so disappointed by what we see in the news and how fractious things appear. I've got to tell you, working with OSTP, working with the National Science and Technology Council, working on this lab-to-market program together with all of you is a model for how government should work. It truly is an exciting time. There's great partnership in Washington. Don't forget it, and let us not forget this tremendous opportunity that we are embarking upon. May I have the first slide, please? So let me go back. Yep. So basically what this is about is capturing the value from our federal investment for global innovation leadership for this country. And we can look at the statistics. The United States is in a race like we've never been in before. And so this requires investing intelligently and leveraging the products of those investments that come from our federal laboratories. You've seen this before. It's a core part of the president's management agenda, and we're really acting to create value from the $150 billion or so that's invested in universities and our federal labs. Some of you were actually at the kickoff event for return on investment and unleashing American innovation, and this took place at the Institute of Peace in Washington, and truly had the highest level support from across all of government, across the federal science agencies. The journey that's taken us till today has involved thousands of stakeholders. Let's not forget that, because every university, every industry association that cares about innovation has participated through written commentary in the fora that have taken place across the country. And a lot of these have been managed in partnership with the Patent and Trademark Office and their regional offices in Silicon Valley and in Denver, as well as in Alexandria. The green paper is out. Find it, study it. You've got the Cliff Notes version that you can pick up if you haven't already from the registration desk here at the FLC. And we'll be going through a little bit more of the detail with you now. Jennifer has already mentioned that the green paper itself is something that's going to become part of how we report on performance.gov through the CAP goal structure for our country. As part of the journey, we've also highlighted certain areas that industry and other stakeholder groups have said, this needs to be addressed. Now, it may not be in the direct authorities that are present with NIST, the Department of Commerce, and indeed in sort of the direct connections that are represented in the interagency team, but we can work then with these recommendations elsewhere. And I'll give you some examples of what we heard. Jennifer provided the categories of the ROI findings. And so this is an integral part now of our reporting back to you as well as to the American people. So let's go into a little bit greater detail under the first category of regulatory impediments, administrative improvements. This is part of the heavy lift that we're going to be embarking on very soon. There's been confusion out there about the government use license. And what's its scope? When does the government invoke that? And part of the action that's intended to be considered next is how do we properly scope that so that as industry invests in areas where the federal government is going to be a customer, either directly or indirectly, that there's clarity about the government's rights. March-in rights are another area that are an important part of this consideration. We heard time and again from people that there are attacks going on the Bayh-Dole Act, that there are people who want to utilize march-in rights for control of drug pricing and for forcible license of technologies. And indeed, we're going to be in the midst of probably a political conversation. There's some special interest groups that are out there who care deeply about prescription drug pricing, but all of us do. And so what is the intent of the legislation? How can we clarify it to ensure that it does not become what it was not intended? That is, the Bayh-Dole Act was not intended to be a drug pricing mechanism, or indeed a pricing mechanism of any kind. U.S. manufacturing preference. This is another area that we've had a lot of conversation about. I think there's a great desire within the administration, certainly, in the conversations that we've had with the Lab to Market group, that we have to streamline the waiver process for U.S. manufacturing preference, to ensure that there are no unnecessary delays. The whole idea is to move this process of technology transfer to all right, it may be my lithium battery that's starting to go down on me here. Right? We'll see. I may need to move to Plan B here shortly. But the other consideration that we had was, well, we're really trying to encourage overall U.S. manufacturing through these initiatives. And so there's been some debate about whether U.S. manufacturing preference language should be applied to both exclusive as well as non-exclusive licensing. And so there's been debate and feedback from industry on that topic. And so I know that we'll be continuing the conversation with this group. Overall, the sentiment that came back as part of the ROI initiative green paper is, let's not create yet another hurdle for U.S. industry to jump over. That is, we have a lot more non-exclusive licenses than exclusive ones in certain of our core markets for this country. But what we do have, let's streamline it, let's modernize it, let's use new tools. Protection of proprietary information under a CRADA and the connection between trade secrets and sort of the needs of industry to have extended coverage of trade secrets that would otherwise be shared in a CRADA if you need to have the right kind of collaborative partnership. And so one of the findings in the green paper is to look to extend the protections for industry who will be sharing their proprietary information as part of the process. The Stevenson-Weidler Act doesn't currently have the same kind of promulgation of regulations through the Department of Commerce as the Bayh-Dole Act does. And so one of the findings was, let's bring this together with the Department of Commerce and ensure that we have consistent long-term focus on Stevenson-Weidler and to ensure that it's continued to be modernized for the entire federal complex and not have a whole series of necessarily divergent processes that would become confusing for U.S. industry players and entrepreneurs. The other aspect of the assignment of invention rights by federal employees can sometimes be a burdensome process. And so the idea is to take a look at modernizing that overall approach and ensure that it's streamlined for the 21st century. Under strategy number 2, increasing engagement with the private sector. So one of the important elements here, and we talked earlier about the ACT mechanism and how that delivered new flexibilities to the Department of Energy system and the government-owned contractor-operated facilities. Having new streamlined tools that are available across the entire federal complex to enable much more agile partnerships is a goal of this journey. And so that will be part of our consideration under these findings to look to modernize the Stevenson-Weidler Act. The partnership agreements that are available to business for translational R&D to enable investment at that interface is an important area for us to focus on. Outside the scope of the ROI initiative, but really important to all of the team and certainly also to the White House, is the consideration of an expanded R&D tax credit that would incentivize companies to come back to the interface with U.S. federal labs and U.S. universities. that the investment tax credit would also include, similar to what the London Stock Exchange has with the junior exchange that's called the alternative investment market, is to incentivize investment in early stage US enterprises that are connected with the federal labs and the universities. And the other aspect of this is also looking at the authorization of the use of federal funds for intellectual property protections. And certainly universities have struggled sometimes to get funds released for capturing the IP that comes out of the grants that they're working against. And so this change would actually then encourage the use of a certain amount of federal grant funds for intellectual property protections in the national interest. And so that would include the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. The other extramural funding programs would have the ability to authorize the use of their funds for this and for other purposes that support intellectual property capture and commercialization. Building a more entrepreneurial R&D workforce, and again, Jennifer mentioned some of these elements. Having technology entrepreneurship programs, and also, frankly, with this community of the FLC, it's leading by example. It's enabling entrepreneurs within your organization to flourish and find the pathways to say, yes, you can do that. And so looking at new types of leave programs, best practices, the utilization of a new authority for the creation of not-for-profit entities for the purposes of technology transfer and commercialization enablement is a part of this broad portfolio. That also will assist in the management of conflict of interest. As tech transfer professionals, we embrace conflict of interest because that comes from the whole invention process, right? So it's helping our organizations to have procedures, protocols, and sharing across the community of practice with the FLC and with the lab to market interagency to ensure that these practices are broadly used and become part of the American fabric of innovation. Strategy number 4 is innovative tools and services for technology transfer. Making it easier to report data on intellectual property. Before we mentioned iEdison as one example of that, as a system that has been recommended for modernization as well as for transfer to the Department of Commerce under NIST to lead the modernization of that tool together with the stakeholder community to support reporting across the federal sector and the academic sector. It was also mentioned that there are a number of really interesting models that are being developed to support intellectual property marketing and aggregation. I'm glad that we have representatives here from Dun & Bradstreet and Barrico that's actually working on a new model for aggregating information across the federal, as well as looking at the partnership with Autumn around the academic intellectual property access. The other part of this that's really important is not only supporting industry in finding technologies that are of interest to them and aggregating them across the entire federal complex, and having the chance then to build new enterprises that take advantage of work across all federally funded agencies. The other part of it is driving research collaborations across the federally funded enterprise. And so that's the other element that we really want to stimulate here, is to create connections using modern IT-enabled systems that will allow new value-added connections, in particular across the United States. So that although we will be continuing research collaborations with international partners, it's going to be very important for us to ensure that we have the greatest synergy across the federally funded research enterprise so that we can make sure that we're actually building partnerships for research section there. Lastly, under Strategy 5 is looking at global science and technology trends and benchmarks, metrics of how we report, how we understand impact. And I must say, on a personal level, it's been a thrill for me to visit Startup Nation. So I was in Israel not long ago, meeting with the leaders of their innovation enterprise, looking at how they're structuring public-private relationships, how they're utilizing the venture capital and the entrepreneurial community to assess technologies coming out of their universities, out of their federal labs, so that follow-on investment is intelligently directed, but it's not, quotes, the government picking winners. It's a righteous process that's being put in place between the public and private sectors to ensure that innovation is effectively supported. So global benchmarking is very important. I mentioned Israel. I've recently been to Singapore, have spent some time with the members of the European Commission, the United Kingdom's Research and Innovation Group, the leaders of the innovation system within Germany, in Japan, and other nations. We will continue this, and those are just a few personal examples. It's also an opportunity for us to leverage our connections across the federal enterprise where we have international reach. I'm glad to see USAID is here. We had a nice conversation earlier on, but also looking at how do we create strategic investments internationally that create the kind of relationships for US innovation leadership, our message of the American dream and the quality of life in a free nation that is offered uniquely and specially on this planet by this country. There's a lot of work to be done. Jennifer mentioned some of the milestones that we'll be tracking. There's going to be a lot more. And to the response that I gave to Tom Stackhouse's question earlier today, it's going to be very important for us to have an action and implementation plan that we're very clear and deliberate about, because we're not just talking about ultimately implementing the results of new legislation or regulatory authorities. This is a long-term journey. This is culture building. This is embedding expectations not only into our current organizations and their leadership, but establishing a constancy of purpose for this nation that will go beyond administration boundaries, that will go beyond leadership changes and personnel changes at each of the science and technology agencies. It's important for us to bake in these changes for the durable impacts that we are seeking. So we will be on a journey to develop a legislative and a regulatory package for Stevenson-Weidler and for Bayh-Dole and their follow-on legislations. We're really focused on new tools and services, and this group is absolutely essential to the effective planning and the effective implementation of the outcomes of this journey. Sharing best practices is not just a one and done type of a process. This is an ongoing journey. We're going to learn from each other. We're going to learn from the other players around the world. The FLC is going to continue to be part of that journey of building cultures of durable innovation and innovation ecosystems that are so important for ongoing US leadership. The Patent and Trademark Office has a series of changes too. We're working with them now to embed the change under their authorities for small entity status recognition, so that small entities that take a license from a federal laboratory or that are working as a CRADA partner are not saddled with large entity filing fees. PTO has agreed to this change, and we're now working through the mechanics of that. They're looking at how this is going to affect their rate structure, and as you know, they are not a directly appropriated agency. They're funded by fees, but their fees have to be approved by Congress. And so if there's going to be a net reduction in their fee intake, then it's going to be an important thing for them to model this appropriately and then to manage their fee structure going forward in an appropriate and responsible way. With SF on I-Corps, SBA on the future of the SBR, STTR programs, and it is awesome having Jennifer, who is a great conduit and partner who understands the heartbeat of the SBA and these programs, and then looking to the future of how we measure, how we analyze. Whatever we do, it's going to be through a righteous, transparent, open process so that we're not holding secrets from the American people, from our taxpayer. This is all about accountability, delivering reports on our progress, but also securing value to America in the changes such as we were talking about before, in limited copyright to be able to be granted to federal agencies to ensure that digital products, software products are utilized and effectively managed for the benefit of the US economy rather than given away to the rest of the world with the hope that some value will come to the United States. Hope is not a strategy. We're focused now on strategies that we believe are going to deliver value for this country. So the NIST website has the green paper. Some of you may have already been pinged with the press release that came out today. We're excited about that. This is a moment for us as an FLC community, as an interagency team that's worked really hard, but also has taken the time to listen to our community, to pause and say, well done, now let's get on for the real work. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. So why don't we go ahead and open up the floor? Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, do you want to comment on
Yeah,
that?
no, so we are, I'm not sure which, am I using this microphone? Okay. No, thank you so much for bringing that up because, exactly that milestone I was talking about in terms of how we're trying to enhance our development of the R&D innovation ecosystem, and specifically regionally. All the labs, the universities that are federally funded, they are located in some place in a community. And many of them are within a stone's throw of multiple opportunity zones and can really serve that anchor point. And so, yes, we are definitely actively working with the Domestic Policy Council. So there's I can't remember the name of the council anymore, the Economic Revitalization, but the Opportunity Zone Interagency Working Group to make sure that R&D is something that they are actively pulling in and looking at as a way to support entrepreneurship and economic development.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that, Brian, and I think that's a really phenomenal leverage opportunity that we have. This is a chance for us to tie these opportunity zones to true innovation drivers, and having sort of a strategic view on this also, one of the authorities that we are seeking as part of the ROI initiative follow-on from the findings is also the extended use lease authority of federal lands, and some of those are adjacent to opportunity zones, and so the creation of new university federal research parks and the ability to create business incubation, facilities, et cetera, as a genuine public-private partnership adjacent to opportunity zones or in areas of high density of innovation resources, I think is going to be a phenomenal multiplier effect for us.
And just an ask, if you already know that you are doing something in developing your regional innovation ecosystem that happens to be in an opportunity zone, please do email me with those examples so then we can use that again to kind of continue to promote the spread of that model.
One of the other things we heard about this morning was from the Manufacturing Extension Partnerships and Manufacturing USA. And quite frankly, with their broad regional reach across the country, many of them touch opportunity zones as well and provide resources for manufacturers and for entrepreneurs across the country. And that's another resource that's available to us that we must ensure that we utilize fully.
Any last questions before we wrap up? I know we got another session coming on the tail of this one. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If we could have some applause for our speakers here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul.